The late autumn air in Maplewood was crisp and fragrant, laced with the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. Golden trees lined the sleepy town's narrow roads, their branches swaying gently in the breeze as if whispering secrets to those who passed beneath. It was in this picturesque stillness that Emerson Blake found herself for once slowing down. She sat at the edge of the town's modest bookstore cafe, a place that smelled of cinnamon scones and old paperbacks, with her laptop open but untouched. Her fingers hovered above the keys as she stared blankly at the screen. A travel writer by profession, Emerson had explored bustling cities, hidden villages, and remote mountains. But after the chaos of the past few months, her father's sudden illness, a breakup that left more questions than answers, and a creeping sense of burnout, she'd needed somewhere quiet to breathe. Maplewood, with its amber hills and forgotten charm, had seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while. Across from her, the bell over the bookstore's door jingled as a gust of wind followed someone inside. She didn't bother to look up until a baritone voice called out to the barista, a mix of warmth and sarcasm that pulled at her attention like a magnet. Let me guess. Still out of the blueberry muffins that you never actually order but keep pretending are on the way? The barista laughed, clearly used to his teasing. Still here, pretending to be a regular, huh? Emerson turned her head just enough to see him. He was tall, lean, but broad-shouldered, with tousled dark hair that fell into his eyes like it had a mind of its own. He wore a navy blue Henley shirt under a worn leather jacket, and the kind of lopsided smile that made people instinctively trust him. He looked out of place, like he belonged in a city or maybe on the pages of a novel. But there he was, arguing about muffins in a bookstore cafe like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if sensing her gaze. His eyes flicked to hers deep hazel, with just a hint of something unreadable behind them. He offered a quick nod, a silent acknowledgement. "Don't worry," he said, loud enough for her to hear, but soft enough to feel like a secret. "They never have the muffins." Emerson blinked, caught slightly off guard. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied, her lips twitching into the beginnings of a smile. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and turned to wait. But instead of leaning against the wall or checking his phone, he looked back at her. "You're not from here." It wasn't a question. "No," she said slowly, setting her laptop aside. "Is it that obvious?" "Only a little," he said, gesturing to the untouched scone on her plate. "Locals know better than to order those," she laughed. "Noted." "I'm Caleb," he offered, stepping closer. "Caleb Monroe." "Emerson," she said, reaching out to shake his hand. "Emerson." "Blake." "Ah," he said thoughtfully. "Like the poet." "Exactly like the poet. Except I write articles about kayaking in Guatemala and the best ways to eat street food without getting sick." "That's oddly specific," he said, smiling. "I'm a travel writer," she explained. "On sabbatical ... sort of." His brow arched slightly. Sabbatical or escape? She hesitated. The truth was, it was both. A little of both. He didn't press, just nodded, like he understood in ways he didn't need to say aloud. The barista called his name, and he retrieved his coffee, lifting it in a mock toast. "Well, Emerson Blake, welcome to Maplewood. Watch out, this town has a way of convincing you to stay longer than you planned." "I'll take my chances," she said, watching him walk out with the same curious fascination one has when watching a comet streak across the sky brief. Brilliant and oddly important. Later that day, as she strolled through the market square with a scarf wrapped tight against her neck, Emerson saw him again. This time, he was helping an elderly man load pumpkins into the back of a rusty pickup truck. He wasn't smiling or charming like earlier. He looked focused, quiet, strong. Something about that small act of kindness settled under her ribs. Maplewood, it seemed, was full of quiet surprises. And Caleb Monroe might be the most intriguing one yet. Emerson Blake had always been a woman in motion. Her passport was a mosaic of stamps from cities most people only dreamed of visiting: Copenhagen, Nairobi, Kyoto, Santiago. The thrill of unfamiliar streets, unknown languages, and stories waiting to be discovered had always pulled her forward. She lived for the in-between moments, watching sunrises from airport terminals, scribbling notes in dog-eared travel journals, and chasing the spark of human connection in places she may never return to. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. After years of romanticizing distance and chasing deadlines for glossy travel magazines, Emerson had grown tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Her life, though colorful, felt hollow. Her writing, once vibrant, had started to sound like a guidebook rather than the heartfelt reflections she'd once penned. And then her father fell ill. She dropped everything: an assignment in New Zealand, a potential book deal, to return to New York and be by his side. For 6 months, she traded train rides for hospital hallways and press trips for late-night conversations about everything and nothing. When he passed in the quiet stillness of spring, something in Emerson stilled too. She didn't want to chase anymore. She didn't want to write about the world until she figured out where she truly belonged in it. So, with no destination in mind, she packed a small bag and pointed her car north. That's how she ended up in Maplewood, a town not found in glossy brochures, but one that smelled like fireplaces and homemade bread, where strangers waved from porches and time slowed just enough to let the heart catch up. She rented a cottage on the edge of town, small, charming, with creaky floors and ivy curling up its wooden fence. Each morning, she walked to the bookstore cafe, not to write, but to sit, to feel, to breathe, and that's where she met him. Caleb Monroe. Caleb hadn't always lived in Maplewood. In fact, for most of his adult life, he'd done everything he could to escape it. Raised by his grandfather after his mother left and his father drifted in and out of their lives, Caleb had learned young that staying in one place didn't guarantee anything, especially not love. So he left as soon as he could, enrolling in an architecture program across the state and never looking back. For nearly a decade, he built a name for himself in the city. A successful design firm, a luxury apartment, a fast-paced life that looked good from the outside but never quite fit on the inside. It wasn't until the call came that his grandfather, the only constant in his life, had suffered a stroke that Caleb returned to Maplewood. Just for a few weeks, he told himself. Long enough to help with recovery, fix up the house, and then leave again. But weeks turned to months. His grandfather, ever the stubborn soul, refused assisted care. And in that quiet, worn-down home filled with memories and creaky floorboards, Caleb began to remember who he was before he traded his soul for skyline views. He reconnected with his roots, volunteering for town restoration projects, sketching designs for local businesses, and rediscovering the joy of building not just structures, but lives. He took over his grandfather's small woodworking shop, repurposing it into a space that blended architecture with craftsmanship. He built furniture, helped restore the old library, and on weekends, ran woodworking classes for teens. Still, he didn't let people too close. He was known, liked, even admired, but no one really knew him. He'd mastered the art of deflection with charm, using humor as a shield. Maplewood may have softened him, but parts of him remained tightly locked away. That was until Emerson arrived. Was different from the usual faces. Her presence stirred the air around her, like a quiet hum he couldn't quite ignore. She didn't try to fit in, nor did she pretend to understand the town. She simply observed, curious and unafraid to sit in silence. Caleb noticed how she smiled more with her eyes than her lips, how she always seemed a little lost in thought, as though she were carrying stories heavier than her. Small frames suggested Maplewood itself was the kind of town that felt paused in. Time, its rhythm set by the seasons rather than schedules. Children still played hopscotch outside the post office. Couples held hands in the park during sunset strolls. Local festivals like the annual Harvest Fair and the Winter Lantern Walk weren't events, they were traditions. People remembered birthdays, favorite pie flavors, and the way grief clung quietly to those who'd lost someone. It was a town that wrapped around you if you let it. Emerson wasn't sure she wanted to be wrapped up by anything or anyone. She spent most of her days exploring the edges of Maplewood, camera slung over her shoulder, documenting not for work, but for herself. An old tree by the lake that looked like it held secrets. A worn rocking chair left outside a closed-down diner. Faces of people she didn't know but somehow felt drawn to. Occasionally, she'd see Caleb sometimes at the cafe, other times, fixing the old railing outside the flower shop, or sketching on the back of napkins in the corner booth of the pub. He always greeted her with that same knowing smirk, as if he understood her silence and didn't expect her to explain it. One afternoon, they crossed paths again, this time at the town's weekend market. "You again," Caleb said with a soft grin, holding a basket of apples. "Me again," Emerson replied, eyeing the handmade candles at the next stall. "You ever going to tell me what brought you to Maplewood? Or are you planning on remaining mysterious forever?" She paused, debating whether to give him the real answer or a playful one. She chose the latter. "I heard there was a cafe with terrible scones and decent coffee. Thought I'd investigate." He chuckled. "Well, your sources weren't wrong. They walked the market together that day. Not because they planned to, but because it felt natural. They talked about favorite books, travel, architecture, and maple cider. They didn't touch on the heavy things, not yet. But something began to unfold between them. Not quite friendship, not quite anything else. Just ... possibility ... later that night." Emerson stood on the porch of her cottage, watching the stars blink into life above the treetops. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to run. Something about Maplewood, about Caleb, made her feel strangely grounded inside. She opened her laptop and typed for the first time in weeks. Not an article, not a story for publication. Just her thoughts. Maybe stillness doesn't mean you're stuck. Maybe it's where healing begins. And a few streets away, Caleb sat at his workbench, carving a delicate curve into the leg of a chair he was building. But his mind wasn't on the design. It was on a woman with curious eyes and a quiet sadness he couldn't name. A woman who made him wonder, for the first time in years, what it might be like to let someone in. It started with small things. A wave exchanged through the frosted windows of the cafe. A shared table when the others were full. Quick conversations that stretched longer than either of them meant for them to. The following week, Emerson found herself sitting across from Caleb again. This time, the conversation flowed like they were old friends. He asked her about her travels, not in the typical, "What was your favorite place?" kind of way, but with genuine curiosity. "What made you keep going all those years?" He asked one morning as the cafe bustled around them. She stirred her coffee slowly. "I think I was always trying to find something that made me feel like I belonged." He nodded, watching her carefully. "Did you ever find it?" She smiled softly, eyes lowered. "Not yet." That answer stayed with Caleb. Later that afternoon, he found himself walking toward the edge of town where her rented cottage sat nestled among yellowing trees. He wasn't even sure why he was there until he saw her crouched near her garden fence. Camera in hand, focused on a butterfly landing on a patch of late-blooming lavender. "You sneak up on people often?" She asked without looking up. "I wasn't sneaking," he said. "Just wandering." She finally stood and brushed her hands on her jeans. "You want tea?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." Inside, her home was cozy and unpolished books stacked on chairs, her camera equipment half sorted near the fireplace. He took a seat near the window as she boiled water. The silence between them was easy, comfortable. "Do you always live like this?" he asked, gesturing at the scattered mess with a teasing tone. Emerson glanced back at him, amused. "Like what?" "Like someone who never plans to stay." That struck a chord. She poured the tea without answering, then passed him a mug. "Maybe I've never found a reason to." Caleb didn't press. But as they drank in silence, the truth hung in the air like mist. Neither of them had really stayed anywhere until now. The following weeks folded gently into each other, like the pages of a well-loved novel. They started meeting intentionally, a walk through the park after a storm, a spontaneous visit to the town library to look for a book she vaguely remembered from childhood, a joint effort at the local fall festival where she ended up helping him at the woodworking booth. "You're surprisingly good at this," he said as she smoothed a corner of the wooden ornament she was sanding. "I once fixed a flat tire in real Nepal with duct tape and optimism." "This is nothing," she replied, grinning. He laughed, the sound low and warm. "You're something else, Emerson Blake." That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her when he said it. One late October evening, Caleb invited her to the workshop. "I want to show you something," he said. Curious, she followed him through the quiet streets to the converted barn just behind his grandfather's old house. Inside, the scent of sawdust, pine, and cedar lingered in the air. The space was lit by strings of soft white lights that looped overhead like a starry sky. He led her to the corner where a half-finished piece sat covered by a cloth. "I've been working on this for a while," he said, lifting the cloth dotted. Was a wooden bench, simple, elegant, carved with tiny details that looked like waves and winding paths. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "I started it after my grandfather's stroke. I didn't know what it would become. But then you arrived and started talking about all the places you've been. And suddenly I knew. It's a bench for people like you, restless hearts, people who need a place to pause." Emerson blinked, back the emotion rising in her throat. She didn't have words, just a swelling warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Do you always do this?" she asked. "Do what?" "Make things that speak directly to someone's soul." He smiled shyly. "Only when I mean it." That moment shifted something between them. After that night, the air between them pulsed with unspoken things. Every glance lasted a second too long. Every accidental touch, brushing fingers, bumping shoulders, lingered with electricity. One evening, they sat on the dock by Maple Lake, legs dangling over the water, watching the moon rise. "I used to think falling in love was a myth," Emerson said quietly. He looked over at her. "Why?" "Because it never stayed. People didn't stay. I learned to expect departure. I'm still here," he said. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the man who made her laugh, but the one who had stayed steady through every moment she tried to run. And in that silence, with the stars reflecting off the lake, something fragile and profound passed between them. Not a confession, not yet, but something close. The days that followed were a slow dance of discovery. He showed her how to use a lathe. She taught him how to hold a camera with the patience of a storyteller. They found a rhythm, soft and deliberate. One night, when a thunderstorm rolled through Maplewood, she showed up on his porch, soaked and breathless. "The power's out at my place," she said, hair clinging to her neck. "I didn't want to sit in the dark alone." He didn't ask questions, just handed her a towel and made tea by candlelight. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, thunder rumbling in the distance. "I used to love storms as a kid," she said. "They made me feel small, in a good way. Like the world was reminding me there's more than just my thoughts." Caleb watched her, the flickering candlelight dancing across her face. I like that, he murmured. The idea that something bigger is out there reminding us to feel. Their eyes met and held. Do you feel it now? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he said, and he did. He felt everything. They didn't kiss that night, not yet. But it was the first time Emerson leaned her head against his shoulder and let it stay there. It was the first time she let someone hold her hand without pulling away, and that meant more than any kiss could. The change between them wasn't loud or sudden. It unfolded slowly, like morning light filtering through autumn leaves, gentle, golden, and warm. After that thunderstorm evening, something unspoken but understood began to settle between Emerson and Caleb. They didn't label it. They didn't rush it. But their lives began to shift around each other like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. On Saturday mornings, Emerson would bring fresh croissants from the cafe and show up at Caleb's workshop before he even opened the doors. She'd sit on a stool, sipping coffee while he worked. She asked questions about the wood, what made cherry better than pine, how to tell the grain's age, why he worked barefoot when no one was watching. It helps me feel grounded, he said one day, tapping his toes on the cool cement. The world feels steadier when I'm connected to something real. She understood that. After all, it was what she had always chased in her travels, something that felt real. And here, in a small town she'd never heard of 2 months ago, with a man who worked with his hands and believed in the quiet magic of simple things, she was beginning to find it. One evening, Caleb invited her to his grandfather's house for dinner. The old man, Harold Monroe, had mostly recovered from his stroke, but moved a bit slower now. He was sharp, though, with a dry wit that reminded Emerson where Caleb got his charm. So, Harold said between bites of roasted chicken, "You're the girl who's got my grandson carving poetry into benches and smiling at his coffee." Emerson laughed. "I can't take credit for that. I think the town deserves more of the praise." Harold winked. "You'll learn this town doesn't work its magic unless it wants to. Caleb's been here over a year, and you're the first new thing that's made him look alive." Caleb gave his grandfather a mock glare, but there was no heat behind it. After dinner, while Harold dozed in his recliner, Caleb and Emerson sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket they shared, mugs of hot apple cider warming their hands. "Sorry about him," Caleb said softly. "He's never been one for subtlety. He's sweet," Emerson replied, resting her head on Caleb's shoulder. "I think it's nice being around people who say what they mean." Caleb turned slightly, enough to see her profile lit by the soft glow of the porch light. "And what do you mean, Emerson?" She took a breath. "I think." Her words caught in her throat, but then she looked up at him, eyes honest and wide. "I think I feel more like myself around you than I have in a long time." His gaze held hers. He didn't speak, not at first. But then, with a gentleness that nearly undid her, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then I hope you stay." And she didn't look away. Over the next few weeks, they began to share more than just mornings and markets. They shared memories, the kind you offer only when you trust someone to handle them with care. Caleb told her about his mother, the woman who left when he was 10 and never looked back, about the hollow space she left behind, and how his grandfather had stepped in without complaint, raising him with firm kindness and too much coffee. Emerson shared stories of her father, how he used to read poetry to her every night before bed, how he believed she could do anything, and how losing him felt like her compass had been shattered. They learned each other's habits. Caleb hummed when he was deep in concentration. Emerson talked to herself when she edited photos. He loved cherry pie. She hated cinnamon. He took evening walks when he couldn't sleep. She scribbled poetry in the margins of her journals when the words felt too heavy to say aloud. One chilly afternoon, Caleb took her hiking up Pine Hollow, the highest overlook in Maplewood. They packed a picnic sandwiches, fruit, and thermoses of tea and climbed slowly as golden leaves crunched beneath their boots. At the top, the world stretched out below them, rolling hills, winding roads, the silver curve of the river that cradled the town. I come here when I need to think, Caleb said, setting down the blanket. Or when I forget that the world is still beautiful. Emerson sat beside him. I used to look for views like this everywhere. I thought they'd fix the mess in my chest, but now it's not just the view. It's who you share it with. He turned to her, his eyes soft with understanding. May I? He asked, voice almost a whisper. She nodded. And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed or hungry. It was slow, reverent, like he was memorizing the shape of her soul through the press of their lips. Her hands found his, and for a long moment, the world disappeared around them, just wind, light, and something that felt achingly close to forever. When they pulled away, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything that mattered. From that day forward, the shift was complete. They began spending most evenings together, sometimes at his place, sometimes at hers. Emerson cooked badly, and Caleb pretended to love her oversalted pasta. He played old records on a dusty turntable while she danced barefoot in the kitchen. They built a rhythm of simple, sacred moments, falling asleep on the couch, watching black and white movies, sharing books, and talking late into the night about everything they'd once been afraid to admit. They didn't say I love you, not yet, but it hung between them and the way she waited for him outside the cafe in the mornings, and the way he brought her sunflowers from the market, even though she'd never told him they were her favorite. There was one moment, though small, quiet, that nearly said it all. Caleb had carved a wooden camera for her, a delicate, miniature version of the one she always carried. Inside the lens, he'd placed a tiny compass, so you'll always find your way back, he'd said. She held it like something sacred, eyes misted with emotion. And in that moment, Emerson knew this wasn't temporary. This wasn't just a pause. This was the beginning of something she never thought she'd find at home. It started with a phone call. Emerson had just returned from an early morning walk, cheeks flushed from the cold, when her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen in months. She stared at it, heart tightening. The call was from her editor in New York. For a moment, she debated letting it ring. But old habits and buried dreams had sharp claws. Emerson Blake. She answered, trying to sound casual, still answering. Like a pro, came the familiar voice of Corinne, her longtime editor. How's the sabbatical? Peaceful, Emerson replied, eyes flicking to the golden leaves outside her window. Different. Well, I won't keep you from it too long, Corinne continued. I just wanted to give you a heads up. One of the publishers loved your last long-form piece, the one from Morocco. They're asking if you'd be willing to expand it into a book. A travel memoir, possibly with a visual component. Emerson's breath caught. A book. Her book? That's unexpected, she said slowly. They need a draft outline in 4 weeks. Ideally, you'd head to London in early December to pitch it directly. London, 4 weeks. Her old life calling. Her back with promises she used to dream about. I'll think about it, Emerson said softly, her voice unsure even to her own ears. After the call ended, she sat in silence for a long time. The book offer was everything she'd once wanted. But the thought of leaving Maplewood, of leaving him, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, she didn't tell Caleb. Meanwhile, Caleb had his own battles brewing. Earlier that week, he'd been approached by a development firm interested in partnering with him on a renovation project in the neighboring city. It was a dream project, restoring an entire historic block into artisan shops. Cafes and living spaces, all designed with sustainable materials and community in mind. It was the kind of opportunity he used to crave. A chance to make his mark, but accepting it would mean months away from Maplewood. And from Emerson. He didn't bring it up, either. Instead, they carried on like nothing had changed. That change has a way of making itself known, even in silence. Tension crept in slowly, a pause before a kiss. A moment of distraction in the middle of shared laughter. One night, Emerson sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. The proposal form for the publisher sat open, empty, untouched. Caleb came in, dusted with sawdust and fatigue. He noticed her silence and sat across from her. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated. "I got a call from my editor." He waited. "They want me to write a book based on my past travels. It would mean leaving for a while, maybe a few months, maybe more." He nodded slowly. "That's amazing, Em. I mean, that's what you've always wanted, right?" She looked at him, her eyes unsure. "It was, but now, I don't know." He didn't respond right away, just nodded again and stood to wash his hands. And she didn't ask what's wrong. She didn't say, "I need you to tell me how you feel." Instead, she watched the water run and felt something shift between them, like a thread pulling too tight. The next day, she found the pamphlet on his workbench. Heritage. District redevelopment proposal. Partner architect. Caleb Monroe. It felt like a slap. Not because he had the opportunity, but because he hadn't told her. When she confronted him, her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "You weren't going to mention this?" He looked caught. I just didn't want to make it real until I was sure." She crossed her arms. "So we both get life-changing news and don't tell each other? That's where we're at?" Caleb exhaled hard. "It's not like that, Em." "Then what is it like?" she asked, voice breaking. "Because I don't know where we stand right now." "We stand at a crossroads," he said, stepping closer. "You've got a chance at something huge. So do I, and we both know neither of us plan to stay here forever." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't plan to fall for you either." The words hung there, sharp and trembling. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then why does it feel like we're both afraid to say what we want? Or worse, afraid we want different things?" She looked away. "Because maybe we do." The next week was a blur of avoidance. Emerson buried herself in outlines and late-night writing sessions. Caleb retreated into his workshop, taking on too many projects to avoid thinking. Maplewood, once their sanctuary, felt heavy with silence. They saw each other in passing at the cafe, the post office, the grocery store, but never alone. Never. Long enough to ask the question they were both afraid of: are we letting this go? One rainy morning, Emerson stood by the lake, camera at hand, but couldn't bring herself to press the shutter. She didn't want to capture this moment. She wanted to rewind it. And Caleb, across town, stood in the empty barn with the half-finished bench he'd once crafted for her. He sat on it and let the storm outside echo the one inside him. He had never stayed for anyone before. He'd never wanted to until now. On the eve of her decision, Emerson drove through Maplewood's winding roads, heart in knots. She ended. Up at the overlook, the same one where they'd shared their first kiss. The world below looked the same, but nothing inside her did. She pulled out her journal, the one she'd carried through every country and airport and hostel, and she wrote, "Loving him wasn't a detour. It was the destination I didn't know I was heading for. And maybe loving him means I don't get to have everything else. But if I leave without telling him how much this has changed me, then I'll regret it more than anything I've ever done." Tears blurred the page. The wind howled through the trees. And still she stayed, because running was no longer who she wanted to be. The morning light filtering through the windows of the cafe, painted everything in a soft, golden hue just like it had the first time Harper and Mason met. Only now, everything was different. This was not a place of uncertainty anymore, but one of healing, forgiveness, and renewed beginnings. Mason stood at the entrance, holding a single white daisy in his hand, the same kind she had once tucked behind her ear when they met. Harper looked up from her table, her breath catching at the sight of him. She hadn't expected flowers or grand gestures. She'd expected silence. But here he was, looking like a man who had run every mile of pain to reach this moment. I didn't come to fix the past, Mason said as he approached her. I came because I finally realized loving you was never a mistake, walking away was. Harper's lips trembled, emotion surging in her chest. She stood up slowly, hands clasping nervously. And I realized pushing you away didn't protect me. It only hurt me more. I was afraid of love because I thought it had to be perfect to last. But you showed me that love is choosing someone, even when it's messy, even when it's uncertain. There was a silence, soft and weightless, filled with unspoken forgiveness. And then Mason gently placed the daisy in her hand. May I try again? Not as someone who's running from the world, but as the man who chooses you, Harper, every single day. Her eyes welled up, and this time she didn't blink them away. She nodded slowly, stepping closer until the only thing between them was air and possibility. You already have, she whispered. Weeks passed like chapters of a story written with care and love. Harper and Mason took things slow coffee dates that turned into evening walks, game nights with Jamie that were filled with laughter, quiet moments spent painting together, where words were replaced by looks and smiles. One evening, as the golden hues of dusk settled over the hills, Mason surprised Harper with a picnic by the lake. It was the place they had once visited during their awkward, hopeful early dates. Now, it was a sacred spot, a symbol of everything they had overcome. As they watched the water shimmer with the fading white, Mason turned to her. I used to think love was about perfection, about making everything look right from the outside. But you taught me that love is showing up flawed, unsure, scared, and choosing each other anyway. Harper leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. And you taught me that love isn't about having it all figured out. It's about being brave enough to stay when it gets hard. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Harper froze, her heart leaping into her throat. I'm not asking for a perfect life, Mason said, voice slightly trembling. I'm asking for a life with you. One where we'll fall and rise, get it wrong and try again. Where we'll laugh and cry, grow, and heal together. He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver ring with a tiny sapphire in the center, the color of her favorite paint. Harper Bloom, will you marry me? Tears streamed on her face as she smiled and nodded, unable to speak. She threw her arms around him, the ring slipping onto her finger as naturally as her hand finding its place in his. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. The wedding was small, filled with warmth and laughter. Jamie walked Harper down the aisle, proud and teary-eyed. Eleanor beamed from the front row, holding a bouquet of her own that Mason had handpicked. The entire town, once strangers to Harper, now felt like family. As they exchanged vows under a canopy of fairy lights and wildflowers, Harper felt nothing but peace. Her fears had faded. Her heart had found home. I vow, Mason said voice, steady and full, to never let you feel alone again. To choose you on the hard days. To believe in us, even when it's hard to see the path ahead. And I vow, Harper replied, to trust the love we've built. To grow with you, to walk beside you, even in the storms. And to never forget that loving you was the best decision I've ever made. Years later, they still walked hand in hand through town, older, perhaps, but wiser and stronger too. Harper's studio had expanded. Mason had become a published author, his stories inspired by their journey, and Jamie. He had graduated from college, returning often to the home that had been built on second chances and unconditional love. Every time Mason glanced at Harper, he still saw the girl with paint on her cheeks and courage in her smile. And Harper, whenever she looked at Mason, saw the man who came back not because he had to, but because love had called him home. They sat together on the porch one evening, sipping tea and watching the stars. "Do you ever think," Harper whispered, resting her head on his chest, "what life would have been like if we hadn't met?" He smiled, kissing her forehead. "No, because in every version of life I can imagine, I always find my way back to you." And as the night wrapped its arms around them, one thing was clear: loving each other was never a mistake. It was the beginning of everything beautiful.